Lingua Brutalica is a podcast that uses ethnographic interviews to study language use in the extreme metal community. We are studying a music scene known for its love of themes and topics generally considered offensive, and it is likely that some episodes will touch on topics or opinions some listeners may find tasteless or ethically problematic. Ethnographic researchers aim to adopt the interviewee's point of view so that we can draw out and study the attitudes, beliefs, and practices that are important to them. We want to make it clear that in presenting these conversations here, we do not endorse any of their content. Our aim is to explore the thought processes behind language use in this long-running, international, and yet understudied scene. Hi, and welcome back to Lingua Brutalica with me, Jess Crook, and my co-host, Wes Robertson.
Hello.
And today we're talking to Will Smith from Afterbirth. How you doing, Will?
Very well. Thank you very much for having me. Glad to be here.
Thanks for being here.
So, to kind of begin as we always do, how would you describe Afterbirth music to someone who hasn't heard it before? Like, what genre of metal would you say it falls under and why?
Wow. Well, if somebody wasn't really familiar with death metal and extreme metal in general, I would tell them that it's it's a very niche subgenre of metal that tends to do better in markets outside of the United States. I guess technical and progressive death metal, but with a firm footing in the 90s brutal death metal movement.
Okay, so very much aligned with your categorization on Encyclopedia Metallum and Wikipedia. So very straightforward then. All right. And is that the case with like all of your other projects as well? They're all kind of like in that same category?
Well, Afterbirth, although I'm not the original vocalist, the albums I have sang on have tended to be the more progressive ones. And that going back in my career, I was in a band called Artificial Brain for 10 years and did 3 albums with them. I'm no longer with them. Prior to that, I was in a band called Biolich from New York. And my kind of guttural low-end vocals over somewhat technical, progressive death metal is kind of a running theme in my life, which is interesting because I don't play guitar or keyboards or anything. I've always just been doing the vocals. So that's kind of been my brand. But I also have a band now called Reeking Aura, which is a little bit more traditional in terms of doom and death metal. Not necessarily as technical and as experimental. Probably, getting back to roots of death metal, I think a little bit more is my band Reeking Aura. And I have another band called Exsanguinated, which again, I think is a little bit more on that kind of like dirty, old school death metal vibe. Neither band is really trying to go into space as much as Afterbirth is.
So when you first started like getting into metal yourself, did you start with kind of death metal, progressive, brutal metal, or was there a different road you took that kind of brought you to interest in these genres?
Well, I had two, like most people, I had a little kind of, people from my town, other teenagers that were into heavy metal and into the same thing. And we hung out in the late 90s when I was in high school. And the two guys who were a year or two older than me, who had already been tape trading and ordering underground CDs and going to underground shows as opposed to bigger high-end concerts, they kind of schooled me on stuff. And one of them was my friend Adam Rotella, who is to this day involved in a noisecore act called Anal Birth, which kind of has a cult following. He was like kind of just streamlining the most brutal Mortician, Dead Infection, grindcore, guttural. He's probably the one who played me the first Afterbirth demo long before I was involved with them or knew them back in the 90s. And then another friend of mine was a little bit more into the ordering kind of obscure European CDs and things, and he turned me on to the Finnish band Biolich or Biolich. Their classic album Nespith. They've had a big resurgence the last few years, which is great. And they're very well known for kind of doing the guttural frog vocals over somewhat dissonant, progressive, interesting style death metal. So a little bit of both. I've always. And I think the thing is, though, with the more progressive and technical and interesting stuff, I've developed an ear for that as I've aged because, like I said, I don't play guitar. I have very basic fundamental skills with keyboards or drums. I'm not like the guys in my bands. So over the years, I've developed an appreciation for odd timings and very technically complex arrangements and things like that. I still love grindcore and experimental noise and brutal death metal, but over the years, I've branched out a lot, so a little bit of both, but definitely, I definitely have more patience for certain bands now than I used to.
So when you were first getting into like death, grind, and all these other kind of subgenres, did you ever pay attention to the lyrical content? Did that kind of draw you in at all?
When I was like 14, maybe 13.
Oh, wow.
13, a friend who was a little bit more advanced into metal, but didn't end up sticking to it. I think he was just looking for the shock value and the extreme things at that age that we were at. Somehow got I think he stole it from a record store, a cassette tape of Butchered at Birth by Cannibal Corpse. And at 12 years old, I was already dipping my feet into horror movies and more commercially available heavy metal. But man, Butchered at Birth scared the shit out of me. I remember listening to it, and the idea that it was, I'd already seen horror movies, but the idea that it was music and that these were the lyrics and, who are these guys? I was like 12 or 13, and it wasn't until a year or two later that I really started exploring death metal. And that experience with Butchered at Birth, maybe that's why death metal has haunted me my whole life, because I'm like chasing that extreme experience or whatever. You know what I mean? I ended up loving that album, years later, but death metal turned me off with the lyrics at first. And then as I got older into my into my 16, 17, 18, you love anything that's crazy and extreme. You know what I mean? I was collecting all these gore grind bands and bands that had pictures of dead bodies on the album covers and things like that. And that's become a real source of inner conflict over the years. I don't know if other metalheads, I imagine I'm not the only one in death metal that goes through that. But the ethics of it, I've had an episode on my podcast long ago where we had Adam from Anal Birth on, and we discussed kind of the reasoning and the ethics and the culture of using real autopsy photos and true crime photos on album covers. And I've wrestled with that, and I've wrestled with the misogynistic lyrics and the gore lyrics that are prevalent in the underground scene. To me, it's kind of a battle between anti-censorship, freedom of speech. It's all just shock value. And then how much I want my own sensibilities assaulted. You know what I mean? I love horror movies. I love true crime. I read a lot of books about that. I explore, a lot of dark things in media, but, everyone has their own limit, and all I would say is if you look back at my own bands, which I understand the focus of your podcast is a lot of lyrics, I've avoided a lot of very explicit gore and misogynistic themes. I'm not going to say there isn't anything gross in my lyrics, but I've tried to do it my way, I guess you could say. So there is I think that might be what you're getting at there. It's a source of conflict, kind of, yeah.
So is that like that desire to avoid crossing a certain line? Is that something you think has always existed since you started writing lyrics? Like since your first attempt, is it something you've always kind of had in the back of your mind?
No, when I was in my first band, Cursed Earth, which unfortunately we never recorded any demos or albums for posterity, but we played a lot of shows with that band. I was like 15 or 16 singing in that band. We opened up for Dehumanized and some bands from New York a lot. Maybe it's good that we never recorded the album because the lyrics were gross. Horny, adolescent, teenage boy, into gore grind and death metal and horror movies and whatever else, kind of exercising those demons onto the paper with not much concept of expressing yourself through the lyrics, but just kind of maybe, at that age, going with the flow of what you think death metal is and what the culture is. So yeah, I think at first I started out trying to imitate other death metal bands' lyrics, and I realized over time I wanted to do something a little bit different. I wanted to express myself a little bit differently. And I have some friends who have put out some of the most extreme gore themed artwork and albums and music releases, and sometimes there's things of theirs that I'm not really into, but I it's the underground death metal scene. You know what I mean? I feel it's on the list. It's on the listener, the collector, buyer beware type of thing, I guess you could say, so
You kind of jumped from like shock to complete embrace to trying to find a balance for yourself then over time. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, the shock thing was over quick. That was when I was like just young and too young to get into it. And then a year or two later, I embraced all the horror and gore and all that stuff. And I would say that's like 12, it was too much for me. 14, 15, okay. By 16, I'm writing about abortions and miscarriages and the Virgin Mary and all this, whatever laundry list of generic death metal and black metal concepts come to mind. I was kind of trying to filter them onto the page, and it's like and then the other guys in your band are 17, and your friends are all, it's like a shock value thing. You're trying to shock the other kids in school. You know what I mean? The normal kids or whatever. So it's like, and then I think I'm not going to speak for everyone, but me personally, I got to a point where I was trying to do something a little different. And as much as I still love horror movies. I still love zombie movies and lots of things, but I started exploring science fiction a lot more. I started, I've never been an occultist. I don't consider myself, a follower of any occult practices, but like I said, I've always had an interest in dark themed things. And maybe that's kind of what I wanted to start expressing more than necessarily just imitating what I had seen Cannibal Corpse and, Dead Infection and Mortician sing about.
And is that conflict between like the desire to explore dark themes but not wanting to transgress like certain boundaries through that exploration kind of quintessential to your own personal definition of what makes for, I suppose identifiably metal lyrics, or is it something else?
Well, I guess there's something to be said for pushing your own personal limits, right? Of what's acceptable to yourself, and that's an extremity in itself in metal. I mean, in terms of self-analyzing it, I just think that there are certain people who are trying to make a statement with the extremity of their lyrics and their subject matter, and there's a place for that. And I don't think I'm anyone to like intellectually put that down or say they don't have a right to do that. Up to a point, man. I mean, I'm never going to entertain the idea of child pornography or anything like that. I'll say that. But with me personally, it became a thing of like, well, if I'm going to write about a dead body, I'm going to write it in the form of maybe something supernatural occurring, something a little bit maybe more like science fiction influenced or God, like the band I used to be, an Artificial Brain. It's very much a science fiction band. It's all the lyrics take place in this kind of science fiction universe of my own imagination. But there is lots of horrific body horror and kind of torturous gore situations within this science, because it's not just maybe that's it. Maybe in a way I'm not confronting things as honestly and brutally as other lyricists because I'm creating a bit of a fourth wall for myself by putting it into these science fiction stories and these. I like to think of myself in terms of a lyricist as being inspired by the great authors that I look up to and all the books I read. You know what I mean? And I try to look at when you see the album and you flip through the lyrics, it should be like a book of short stories for me personally. That's what I want to express. So I guess I want to put something in there that has a little bit more of my personality and my own yearnings, my own life. I make there's a lot of references to like fishing and agricultural themes, because that reflects a lot of my family and our life here on Long Island in my lyrics, whereas, somebody like Cannibal Corpse or a band like Deaden, they were just dead bodies, gore, right in your face, the real life. So maybe, again, that's why I wouldn't censor somebody to say that, is maybe they're being more brutally honest than I am. But that's just how that's my line to speak to your question. Maybe that's where I've put myself, is I'm only willing to address these things in the form of my own imaginary, fictitious universes,
Well, this kind of dovetails into a broader question we had, which is, how do you personally define like good versus bad metal lyrics?
I guess you'd have to say it's in the listener. It's in the person reading them, it's what speaks to you.
I mean, yeah, but
stuff to say.
speaking to you, like you, not in terms of, not in like an absolute, like,
Yeah,
I'm not talking about like objectively, on a, how do we scientifically measure, but like just personally, what do you find to be the attributes that make metal lyrics good versus the attributes that make them bad?
Well, again, I think maybe that speaks to what I was saying. I tried to express a little bit of personality, a little bit of originality. Lord Worm is a very easy example from Cryptopsy on their album None So Vile. I mean, the guy's an amazing lyricist, regardless of what album you want to talk about. But on None So Vile, that's just a very epic album that's bigger than the sum of its parts. And lyrically, he has this almost like very highbrow kind of Shakespearean poetic take on these very morbid, macabre topics, So I think he was great because he added so much personality to it. This very like stoic kind of intellectual air to his lyrics, but in a way with a very sardonic sense of humor too. Let's see. Biolich for all those years was a lot of people didn't know what most of their lyrics were because they didn't print their lyrics in the old albums. And they had this kind of like rubric of letters that people thought was maybe some sort of code to figure out the lyrics. But whether it was or wasn't, I don't know. The nature of his pronunciation, you didn't really know what he was saying most of the time. And the actual song titles were like 7 or 8 words, and a lot of it didn't make sense. That was its own approach. You know what I mean? There was a lot of mystery. So for a good metal lyricist, that's its own approach right there. Obscurity and a little bit of mystery is great for metal. Trying to think who else. If you look back at Dead Infection's Chapter of Accidents album, which is a brutally gory album with real gore throughout the throughout the layout, it's just one of those things. But it's an amazing piece of gore grind art, and the thing about it, it's called Chapter of Accidents, and each song, each set of lyrics is a short story about some sort of accident in everyday life. It's like almost like the evil, the banal, or something, like, it's like these stories of just everyday people on a picnic or going to the store or whatever, and this horrible accident occurs or something like that in the lyrics, but it's written with a sense of humor, very kind of like sarcastically. It's brilliant in the way it's written. And there's a little bit of debate as to whether the singer actually uses the lyrics on the recording because you can't understand what the guy's saying. But those are great lyrics. Trying to think off the top of my head any other examples. The Scattered Remnants from Massachusetts, who's now back together and having a resurgence. They had really like lyrics that had really gross death metal concepts, a lot of brutally gory concepts, but kind of written in this, again, like a very romantic, gothic, kind of highbrow way with a lot of passion. Scattered Remnants is a band whose lyrics reflect a lot of passion and longing and this kind of like romantic doom of the human situation. You can tell the guy is putting his own personal pain and his own personal life into the lyrics, even though they reflect maybe something a little bit more grandiose and occultic or something. So I guess maybe I'll stop there. I'm trying to think off the top of my head any other examples.
I mean, those are a lot of good examples.
Okay, yeah. But I guess I'll end there. If I think of anything else, I'll throw it out there.
Yeah, please do. Well, I mean, as you've said, right, you're currently active in like a bunch of bands, like including Afterbirth. So we talked about Exsanguinated, Reeking Aura, and of course you said you used to write vocals for Artificial Brain. So do you view your approach to lyrics across these projects as being relatively similar, or do you have like distinct kind of like mindset sets and approaches for each? And if it is the latter, like what would you say are the kind of biggest differences in your approaches?
Well, I'll start by saying one thing I do is I purposely try to involve my bandmates in each band in the themes and the song titles, because that way, even if you read the lyrics from a Reeking Aura song and an Afterbirth song and you say, that sounds like Will wrote it, the album title, the list of song titles on the back of the album cover are going to look and seem thematically different because of I try to get my bandmates involved in that. So it's not just me writing all the song titles for all the bands, right? So Afterbirth, Cody, the guitarist, comes up with the vast majority of the song titles and themes, and then I kind of take them and run with them and write the actual lyrics about it. Whereas Exsanguinated, the drummer Sam and some of the other guys are always throwing song titles and ideas at me. Reeking Aura, that's a little bit more me. That's like Artificial Brain. When I was in that band, I looked at that as the band where I could use my own ideas for the song titles, and the other bands were the other. So now Reeking Aura is the band where it's a lot of my own ideas for song titles. And so right there, it's like that kind of is a little bit, makes each band a little different. Reeking Aura is not a science fiction setting. If anything, it's more of kind of like a horror setting. It's the album, our first album, this is more of a concept about, a worker on a desolate agricultural facility. Is the guy losing his mind, or is there some sort of supernatural occurrences going on? Who knows? But that's kind of where that is. Whereas Afterbirth is kind of like the door's wide open. I mean, everything went into on the most recent album. It's like everything went in there. Sci-fi movies we've seen, books we've read, true crime concepts, local concepts here on Long Island. It's just a lot. Afterbirth is very wide open and not really nailed down conceptually too much. Reeking Aura is more agricultural kind of, back to the woods, that sort of thing. Exsanguinated is hard, like demonic, old school death metal, incantation, deicide kind of vibes, I guess you could say. So like, I do have set themes for each band. And I do try to keep it separate so it doesn't just sound like it's the same person writing every song title, I guess you could say, And Exsanguinated, I purposely try to make the lyrics more sparse. And I look at it as like there's not as many vocal parts in the average Exsanguinated song as you would find in, say, an Afterbirth song. You know what I mean? So I try to approach each band as if it's a different vocalist, different frontman for each one in a way,
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Well, I mean, given what you've just said about, your personal relationship to lyrics for your different projects, we wanted to know what your opinion was, because a lot of research has kind of suggested that metal artists typically take a sort of distance from their lyrics, positioning them as just kind of entertainment or something not to be taken seriously. And given that, you said that, yourself, that, you have kind of varying relationships to the lyrics that you've written for different projects, like, is this something that you yourself align with? And, has your position on this changed over time?
Good question. It changes. Sometimes it could change from line to line. I mean, I could write something of a short, say the lyrics for this particular song are basically a short horror story. Mm-hmm. There might be some character or some line in there or some sentiment in there that's based on something very real to me. There's in the Reeking Aura, we have a song. Of course, it's the song with the ridiculous title, "A vegetative mush that melts among the shelves, lined with meat of indeterminate origin," is the name of the song. That's written that way to be an obvious reference and an homage to Biolich and their long song for people who would get it. All right, it's just an homage to Biolich, but there is a line towards the end of that song. And this is supposed to be from the perspective of this agricultural worker who's alone on the farm. Is he losing his mind? Is something we don't know? But a line that this person says through me as the vocalist is, "They say that I've changed. They say that I've changed. If it's true, who's to blame? They say that I've changed. It's what was yeah. They say that I've changed. If that's true, who's to blame?" So it's like that to me, that was actually a very personal line. And when I say it and when I see it live, I'm thinking of specific people. So I was never, this agricultural worker at a haunted farm, but I do inject parts of my life in there. Absolutely. And that whole thing goes back to my family has a history of agricultural here on Long Island. I was raised My father was a very old-fashioned guy, hunting, fishing, woods, that sort of thing, boats, everything like that. So a lot of that does make it into the lyrics. But here's the thing too. Like, look at a writer I admire, Stephen King, one of the most successful horror writers in the world. I doubt he's lived all of those stories, but he injects a hell of a lot of his New England existence and the people he knows into those books. If you're familiar with what he does, you know what I mean.
Sure.
So that's it's a line of like how much of your like look at a band like Iron Reagan. Or look at a band like, the more political bands. Look at Terrorizer and Napalm Death. Those bands are pretty much just getting up there and no filter. This is what's on my mind. This is how I feel about what's going on in the newspaper today. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I just take a few extra steps, as an artiste or whatever you want to say to express those things and maybe, mask them or camouflage them within these stories. So it's like a spectrum of how you want to do it. You know what I mean?
Okay. Well, that's a good jumping point to move into our questions specific to your own lyrics. And so we're going to start kind of with Aftermath and with the broader picture. So the first Aftermath album you did lyrics and vocals for was 2017's The Time Traveler's Dilemma. And we wanted to know, before starting to write, since Aftermath had already released some records, did you pay any attention to prior lyrics for the band, or did you kind of just go for your own style? For instance, the song Maggots in Her Smile from that album is probably the goriest song in Afterbirth's repertoire, referring to the rape of a corpse. But that song appears to be written before you joined the band. And this topic of necrophilia, while,
Well, that song in particular, is one of a few songs where they had vocals to it. They had kind of an arrangement to it, and I took it up and I added some of my own parts and made some of the lyrics my own, and things. So it's a little bit of a lyrical collaboration between myself and the prior singer Matt Duncan, rest in peace, who obviously was maybe into more of a more brutal type of lyrical form than I do typically. So it's like right there, I don't want old school Afterbirth fans, of which I'm one, to say, oh, they totally changed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I try to keep a little bit of that darkness and that gore in there. Maggots in Her Smile is an interesting one because it's more written. I'm not trying to do the old extreme lyric escape tactic of it's actually a metaphor, but it is, it's more as we discussed it and as it was explained to me, it's supposed to be written in the way that it could be about facing deception and betrayal in a relationship, with a woman, because that's, the members of the band are all straight men, in this instance. So it's not supposed to be misogynistic. It's just from a more true life perspective. And I think that might also be, that might be the first or second song that I kind of worked on with them when I joined the band. And that's like the beginning of maybe trying to explore these deeper metaphorical concepts, and still keep it a little gore and a little brutal and death metal. You know what I mean? And I think maybe we over time, maybe we've kind of like slowly been able to crawl out of that cocoon even more and more with some of the stuff. But, even if you go on the new album, there's a song, so bad I can't remember the titles of some of my own songs. Autoerotic Asphyxiation, a song title that Cody came up with, one that's definitely inspired by serial killers and the idea of these true crime podcasts and novels that I, like a lot of people, am consuming nowadays. And in the time, what was on the news heavily and has been for a while now here regionally where we are in Long Island, New York, is the Long Island serial killer who they just apprehended after all these years. And that's a whole big rabbit hole. And so am I exploiting that? Am I disrespecting victims and families? We tried to make it, first of all, as not an overt reference to that. We didn't just name the song Long Island Serial Killer. We didn't name the song after the guy's government name. We didn't do that. We just kind of took something that was, basically happening in our backyards here on Long Island, close to the area where we rehearse and record and all that sort of thing. And we were influenced by that a little bit. So even, we still do stay pretty gritty, but I would say nowadays, maybe there's, like I was saying before, maybe we try to veil it a little bit more with mystery and metaphor than just being as blatant as we used to, so it's interesting territory. And I'm not averse to, a little bit of gore and a little bit of horror. It just has to maybe be part of the toolbox, not the whole platter. So to speak.
Well, your vocal style for Afterbirth is quite interesting and distinct, being, some of the most difficult to pass lyrics of anyone we've interviewed, I think, probably. So do you feel that this gives you freedom to kind of write anything, or is there pressure in the opposite direction to really kind of work on your lyrics to show that it isn't just, quote unquote noise?
The latter.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because with the vocal style I do, there are people who do it, and they, there's a thing with ignorant guttural slam, and people have ignorant lyrics, and it's just part of the game. It's, some people it's fun. It's like hip hop, it's, there's very intelligent, well worded lyrics, and then there's other songs that are just there for the energy, kind of. You know what I mean? It's there's a variety, but okay, so going back, my two biggest influences in terms of doing death metal vocals are probably Matt Duncan, the original singer of Afterbirth, rest in peace, and Matty Way of Biolich, who, as I said before, didn't even print his lyrics, pronounced his lyrics in this way you couldn't understand what he was saying. So for me, it's always maybe this little game you're playing with the listener. Besides that, listening to death metal, as much as I do enjoy lyrics and like when the bands print the lyrics, it's never been a deal breaker for me if I didn't know what the guy was saying. Mm-hmm. Especially with the guttural vocals, because something about that guttural bullfrog, whatever you call it, type of vocal, it's kind of at a point now where the lyrics don't matter for the audio component of it. It's just about the tone and what it adds to the music, almost like another bass guitar or something, maybe. But then my thing, which is just for me personally, not every other singer wants to do that, not every other band wants to do this, but I want there to be a lyric book where the listener who does care about, there might be a guy who has that CD 10 years on his shelf and doesn't read the lyrics every time he listens to it. But the people who do care about the lyrics, I want them to say, that's what he's saying? And wait, is that part? Let me rewind that back. I don't know if he said that. You know what I mean? Because I've done that. I did that with like I said, those Lord Worm and the Dead Infection album, all the things I talked about in that other question. I used to do that and sit there and try to figure out what the guy was saying. So it's that's kind of part of it. And there's a lot of people. That's a little bit. I joked around about it on my podcast recently that there's probably it's a little bit of a barrier sometimes for the old school heads, because there's guys that got into death metal and black metal in the 80s, and they don't want to hear anything about guttural vocals. They don't want to hear anything about that bullfrog style. They want to be able to understand what someone's saying and follow along with the lyric sheet. You know what I mean? And so I probably ruined a lot of bands for some of those guys. That's more my generation, is like the late 90s brutal bands when like Dying Fetus and Devourment and all these other bands were blowing, Disgorge. Pronunciation all of a sudden was out the window, and it was more about how it was the opposite. It was about how brutal and unpronounced you could do the vocals. You know what I mean? So that's kind of like the school of thought I come from. And then I also, maybe it's just my ego, I have this thing where I want people to go, oh, there's actually a light bulb in his head too, when they read the you know what I mean? So that's kind of it. Maybe just a little showing off, trying to add a little depth to the lore of the band,
Have you, at live shows, have you ever seen fans sing, well, not singing, but I guess screaming or mouthing along in a way that shows that they clearly know what the lyrics are?
Occasionally. Yeah. Occasionally, but not, I've never been there where there's where you can hold the mic out and there's 20 people and, I'm not, Terror or Madball or any of these bands that have gotten to that point where they can do that. You know what I mean? I don't think any of my bands have actually, there's a few times where maybe some friends or, one show in particular, there were 3 or 4 people who were all familiar with the band. It's happened a little bit here and there, but, which is very flattering and kind of, makes you check yourself like, wow, there's that. And that also then drives it on in the future. There's people that read this stuff, there's people that this stuff matters to. So So yeah, it's happened, but not on that like, cinematic scale where where there's like the whole front audience, whole front row is singing along and you're just like, yeah. No, not like that for me yet. Maybe one day. Yeah.
Well, as we discussed earlier, obviously there are kind of lyrics out there in the world that are a lot gorier than yours, but nonetheless, there is still a definite trend towards topics that could be considered kind of unpleasant or vile in Afterbirth songs, especially scenes of filth. So, for instance, you've written lyrics like awaking in a cold sweat, covered in head to toe in flies. It grinds you like a blender, congealing fat and blood, digested while you're dripping a screaming pile of sludge. Or vomit pools inside my mouth. It spills forward into her face. She gasps and runs in disgrace. Each from one of the 3 albums. So for you, what is the purpose of exploring these scenes of gore, especially themes of like the grotesque and unhygienic?
I'm laughing because I was just trying to think about the context of each of those lines as you were like listing them off. For those lines in particular, all right, the first one though, the waking in a cold sweat, covered in flies, and then running to the mirror, staring back at styes. That's about it was one of the Exorcist films that takes place, I want to say in like the deserts of Africa somewhere. It's not it's not set in the United States. I think it's
3.
I believe you're right. And there was a thing about this where they made kind of 2 similar but regardless, that movie made a big impression on me around the time we were writing those lyrics, and it's directly inspired by scenes in that movie. So that one I can say for that. That's from, what was that? The sand, sifting through the sands of the unholy, I think. So that whole song, Cody gave me that concept about this kind of like some sort of desert, unholy ancient ruin type of thing. So it fit perfectly with that Exorcist movie, and that's that. The one about vomit pools, it's all right, it didn't happen. I didn't vomit into a woman's mouth, but I wrote that line and that song. That's a song on the new album. It's my version of an emo song, of an emo lyric, because it's about I think the song lyrically, the song kind of sets you up. It's a nice day. It's for the listener, it's gonna be funny. Will's on a date. Will's out walking around the park in a nice button-up shirt with his date, and I get so anxious all of a sudden, I throw up, and that's the end of the little movie. It's just like that's kind of just a little gross out, humorous thought, I guess. That the idea of that song was to kind of present like, and that was directly inspired by Chapter of Accidents, the Dead Infection album that I told you about earlier, where each song is a little short story about an everyday situation that goes wrong. So that was kind of my homage to Dead Infection's Chapter of Accidents. Will goes out on a date, things are going good, so that's the explanation for that. That's more of a jokey one to try to get a reaction from the listener. And what was the other one? There was a middle one that I forgot.
More than like, what are each of these 3 songs about? Like, why does this theme of like the unclean and the unhygienic keep popping up in your lyrics?
Because it's death metal, dude. No,
fair enough.
Well,
that's fine. That could be an answer. Yeah.
No, I'm trying to dig a little deeper. I think it's to reflect a little bit of real life grit. Like I said, that one example is a little bit more of a joke. The vomit pools inside my mouth. I purposely pronounced that line a little bit more so people could understand it with the lyrics. I thought the line, the vomit pools inside my mouth, is just a hilarious line. It's like too death metal to be death metal. If I said it with serious conviction in a song, it would mean something different. But that one was kind of a joke. But it's like moreover to like, I have vomited. We've all vomited at one point in our life, most likely.
Sure,
you know what I mean? Whether you're sick or drinking, whatever the case. And it's like, that's the kind of, I want to bring that. I'm not, nor have I ever been the sexy, long-haired, leather-jacketed, metal archetype dude. And it's been part of my brand for a while to bring a little bit of kind of like self deprecating humor to the table, with how I talk on stage, when we play live, how I present myself. And, it just is what it is. You know what I mean? I am who I am. I don't have any tattoos or piercings. I don't begrudge anybody else for how, most of my bandmates, do have that kind of look, but it's just never been me. So it's like, I have a very self-deprecating kind of thing. And part of that is maybe this, the gross out factor of some of my lyrics, and not for nothing. I was never neglected or abused as a kid. I grew up with two great parents, hardworking parents. But I did grow up and live in a neighborhood that's associated more with higher crime, more instances of poverty, more of a hard working class environment. And with that comes a very brutal, at times disgusting sense of humor, especially, as a young man in a blue collar job. I've seen what happens when people get into alcoholism and when people get into drugs. I've been to houses where alcoholics and drug addicts are just having parties all the time. I've dealt with. I'm trying to walk a line here because I don't want to sound like I'm celebrating it. This is a part of life I have to deal with. I have people in my family who who have a disability, and need certain levels of care. I've worked for 17 years in a field with people who have developmental disabilities. And I've dealt with aggressive behaviors. I've dealt with sensitive situations. So if any of that comes out in my lyrics, it's a way for me to vent in a lot of ways too. That one example of me puking while I'm out on a date is just me having fun with it and making more of a joke out of it. But there is a lot, if you want to push for why is there this element of filth and disgust and fecal matter and dirt and unshaven, unclean, that it's maybe trying to process some things that I have seen in my life and I have witnessed, because you do have to get it out when you observe something that's kind of disturbing to you, so maybe that is part of the picture. And what better place to vent that energy than in death metal? I guess that's how I'll answer it.
Cool. Well, yeah, another theme that we noted that we're curious about is that of kind of insects or beasts. For instance, on the Time Traveler's Dilemma, you mentioned bugs 7 times, as in trapped like a fly in a jar, leeches twice, as in this is the routine, the cycle of leeches, and a beast once. But all your albums also contain at least one mention of parasites. 4-dimensional Flesh also mentions a creature, a wolfish impersonator, hands full of spiders, and an unbiological beast made of images that float in the sandstorm of my mind. And your newest album talks about a frog that's in my throat, people who feast on the flies, and an awakened animal. So why do you think these specific kinds of animals appear in your lyrics instead of, say, I don't know, lions or birds or fish, butterflies, rabbits?
You just made my lyrics sound so much cooler than I ever thought they were with these like little greatest hits of lines and words. I really do appreciate it because it's forcing me to think. I don't have the book in front of me. I'm here in my office and I just have like a few books on a shelf, but because this is a big reason why in the last 10 years anyway, lyrically, not this book in particular, but Annie Dillard. I don't know if you're familiar with the author Annie Dillard. She wrote a book, Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek. And that book, I read it maybe 12, 13 years ago, and it stuck with me in like glue, the way that she speaks about nature. We quoted a line from that book in 4-dimensional Flesh, the last Afterbirth album before the most recent one, where she describes ants eating a newborn baby bird and devouring it, but it's like an observation of nature. The way she describes nature and animals and plants and that really changed a lot of how I view writing lyrics, and all that sort of thing. So Annie Dillard, the author, is like a big inspiration to me. The frog in my throat line, there's a few lines. If you ever hear me reference frogs, usually, and croaking, especially in the most recent Afterbirth album, that's like a more self-reflective thing. The line was, I'm trying to think of the specific line, but it was a bit of a self-reflection about the idea of expressing myself through croaking noises that people can't understand the lyrics. It was a little bit of breaking fourth wall and a little bit about what we discussed in this interview, really. So the idea of having a frog in my throat, that's me growling like a frog for the band, literally expressing that to the listener in the lyrics. But all these other references to insects and beasts and animals, like I said, Annie Dillard, but also, I know I'm not the only one. I mean, but I grew up with lots of pets. My parents indulged me with iguanas, rats. We've always had dogs and cats. I grew up in the suburbs here on Long Island outside of New York City, but we have a lot of opportunities for beaches, parks, the woods. I grew up with a lot of experiences in more rural areas here on Long Island. Like I said, my father grew up when Long Island itself was a much more rural area. Fishing, and hunting, those are all big part, and a lot of that comes out in a more natural way, I guess, in Reeking Aura. Whereas I try to maybe express all that stuff in a more fantastic way in my other band, so it comes out. And then the other thing is when I talk about parasites, I'm not an authority on the occult. I'm not an authority on spiritual matters. I can just tell you what I've experienced and what I've researched in my own life. And the idea of some sort of spiritual parasite, energy vampires, it doesn't have to be some deep occultic thing. It could just be a person who actually does just suck up your time and your energy throughout your life, But then there's other theories about occultic parasites, things that might feed on our own negative emotions. I'm inclined to be open-minded towards those schools of thought and those beliefs. I've read up on I try to read up on a lot of different types of mythology and spiritual beliefs and stay open-minded to that sort of thing. So when I talk about parasites and leeches, especially I think in the lyrics you're referencing, it might be a little bit more of that type of thing. Especially in the climate we're at nowadays with UFOs in the news being a hot topic and all this sort of thing. I try to keep it vague, but like anyone else, I've read up on theories about extraterrestrials and UFOs and interdimensional beings, and that's something that's interested me since a child. Like many other people that ended up in metal and other types of subcultures. And I think that comes out a little bit too in the lyrics. You know what I mean? But just, I guess, having an overall appreciation for nature and a fascination with animals and wanting to express that, maybe just as that's part of where I'm from here on Long Island. That's kind of, it's part of how my family, was growing up. And I think it's a very animal archetypes and animal forms that's a very primal thing. You can express a lot using those. You know what I mean? That's a very instinctual thing for us. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's great that you've created this link between the kind of material animals and the supernatural, because that's exactly what I wanted to ask about next, was because, you do have a lot of references to these kind of immaterial beings as well in your lyrics, particularly like spirits and ghosts. In fact, each of your albums contains at least one kind of generic mention of spirits and ghosts, on top of more kind of specific references to types of ghosts or other kind of supernatural entities. So, for example, The Time Traveler's Dilemma has Devouring the Hungry Ghost, about hungry ghosts known as kind of these emotionally driven, almost animalistic spirits that are common to kind of Chinese folklore and Buddhism. You have Four-Dimensional Flesh, which carries on the kind of Buddhist theme with beheading the Buddha. And then Swallowing Spiders seems to describe a kind of Rusalka-type water spirit. And then finally, In But Not Of has Devils with Dead Eyes, Angels Feast on Flies, and Vivisected Psychopomp. With Psychopomp, they're referring to a kind of series of spirits common to various cultures that guide kind of the newly dead to the afterlife. So, yeah, what inspired your inclusion of these kind of various supernatural elements?
Well, all the ones you just mentioned, I think without exception, everything you just mentioned as examples, Cody, my guitarist, inspired them. He's a yoga instructor. That's something that he has spent a large portion of his life and devoted a lot of his life to, is studying yoga and becoming a yoga instructor. I am not as well versed in all of that type of thing, but I know that something that has coincided with that for him is an interest in Buddhism and an interest in a lot of those beliefs and a lot of those kind of deep, those deep metaphorical, mythologies, whatever the appropriate term would be. So he definitely explained the idea of the hungry ghost, devouring the hungry ghost. That's all Cody. And he explained that to me and we talked about it and I kind of wrote it from my perspective. Same thing with Swallowing Spiders, same things with the Psychopomp reference. These are all things that I kind of learned and picked up from Cody wanting them to be reflected in the band. So that's your answer there.
Was there any kind of like drive for you to include deities and ghosts and spirits from different traditions, like, ranging from Christian to Buddhist to like, Chinese, Slavic, or was this just kind of, again, like circumstantial, like by chance?
I would say it's circumstantial because Cody, like I said, the reason for any of these references to like Chinese or Buddhist, occult or spiritual practices is because Cody has a very well established interest in that field of thought and those type of things. Me personally, I was raised Catholic. I've dabbled. Well, I spent some time in an evangelical church, shortly. I spent about a year as part of a black metal band that did practice occult rituals. I myself kind of was just like, all right, guys, I'm just here for the music, and I kind of got involved with it and I experimented with it and was open-minded to it after a year. Still friends with these guys, but I told them it's not for me. So I kind of take from maybe a lot of that with my lyrics. I do read a lot, but I don't know there's no intention maybe of trying to have a well-rounded, from all different cultures. It has a lot more to do with just kind of, like you said, circumstantial, what we know and what we've experienced. But I have made a bit of an effort in my life to learn and to try to take in a lot in that area as I could.
So another theme then that we noted is that of liquids. Your first album has references to vomit and psychic pools. Four-dimensional flesh talks about the sound of slobber, a screaming pile of sludge, drool like a chemical, wretched sea hags boiling the pools of seawater, and ghosts cast to the water. And this theme is particularly prevalent on the new album In But Not Of, as we see lines like "Some come from the sea, some live in the trees," "Hideous remains drift on an ocean of blood dripping," "Vomit floods puddle, it's up to my eyes," "Soak my clothes covered in kerosene," "An open sea of blood from a flowing leak," "The vomit pools inside my mouth" line, and "Even below all these rivers, people talking baits, the ocean." You do have mentions of fire and earth across your albums, but not nearly to the same extent. Do you know where this interest in like water and liquid might have come from and what it means? Is it something you're aware of in your own writing?
Interest, man. I would have to say that I guess I am aware of it because my explanation is I was born and raised and continue to live on an island. Not maybe a traditional island like most people would think of, like Hawaii or something, but Long Island is surrounded by water. We have lots of public and private beaches, state beaches, town beaches. There's beaches all over. I grew up going to the beach, swimming, fishing. There's a huge nautical culture, boating culture that my father was big on. My father had a boat and we would go out on the boat and he, most of his friends were other fishermen down there and clammers and all these types of, so yeah, there's a huge, kind of beach, saltwater fishing culture just all around me from birth. So that's a big part of it. If I ever use the word slobber in my lyrics, it's probably to elicit a little bit of humor. Just like that other song. I think the line that with slobber was actually describing a monster influenced by the xenomorphs in the Alien series, if I'm not mistaken, because they were always drooling. You know what I mean? So yeah, I mean, some of those might be incidental, just by way of I needed to describe something like drool or something like that. But yeah, I mean, I grew up on an island, and we were. In my family and the way I was raised, we definitely took part in all that water stuff. So maybe that's a part of it. Also, I've always been fascinated with references to, because of the sound of my vocals, the sound of the guttural vocals, the frog vocals. I like to slip in references to like milk, like milky and slimy, like kind of, so that maybe it sounds like like the vocals sound. Every once in a while. It's not like it's not like my main motif, but I definitely will kind of put stuff in there, yeah.
Breaking the fourth wall a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. A frog in my throat, kind of, that type of stuff. So yeah, I guess that's the answer,
So this is a pretty out there question. So feel free to totally disregard it. But what I was thinking about in this connection between water, and we talked about spirits and like animals and all this kind of thing. I was wondering, just because in a lot of folklore and myths, as suggested in like swallowing spiders, water is associated with women and femininity, but also the supernatural and the unknown. Hence various, often feminine mythological creatures like mermaids, kelpies, selkies, and rusalka. I was wondering, were you kind of thinking about any of these associations when you kind of developed this theme of like water and the supernatural?
Dead on. Yeah.
Oh,
When I
wow.
was writing,
What?
yeah. Yeah. Like, I guess I think kelpies might be like a sea siren type of, like a female ghost luring sailors to their murky grave type of idea. And I said it in my, not that there's anything in the lyrics that would but in my own imagination when I was writing it, it's set at a beach that's very important in my family that my father and my grandfather always fished at growing up. And I guess the narrative of the song, I don't have the lyrics in front of me, but I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be like me or the narrator being kind of drawn to a murky grave, by these sea sirens who, of course, have a little bit of a horror, they're swallowing spiders. They have that horrific kind of touch to them because it's an Afterbirth song. But yeah, that's, you pretty much summed it up. I mean, that's kind of the idea. And I think when Cody came up with the swallowing spiders title, and I think to him it was supposed to maybe be something like maggots in her smile, where you're kind of like contrasting beauty with insects and creepy stuff, that type of vibe. So, but yeah, pretty much, like referencing, mythological sea sirens. That's pretty much it. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I when I saw Just Write That Question, I was like, he's not going to say yes to that. But there you go.
Yeah,
I'll never doubt again.
It was my pursuit of having like a collection of short stories. How can I make this one different than the other? That type of thing. Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, the final thing we wanted to ask you about briefly was that of the brain or the mind, as lyrics from all of your albums deal with ideas around disturbance and infection of the mind. We see this in lines like infected mind, possession complete. I've got a virus in my mind that I would never want to share with anyone. The frailties found in your fear, the fissures in your mind. When it digests your brains, your memories, your soul will all be locked away. Unbiological beast made of images that float in the sandstorm of my mind. If people only knew the frog that's in my throat was all a dream deep in my brain. And finally, we see this theme most clearly in songs like Multiverse Dementia, which of course references disturbance of the mind in the title. So how do these descriptions of disturbances of the mind, the brain fit in with the other themes we've discussed?
Well, I guess at the risk of losing metal credibility, that might be me being a little vulnerable. Maybe that's where I'm most honest with the lyrics is just express like, we don't always express what's on our mind. We don't always, express our emotions to people. Sometimes we keep it inside. And maybe some of those phrasings of the images in my mind, that sort of thing. Maybe that's what that's supposed to kind of, maybe that's me kind of saying, you guys don't know what I'm thinking, that type of thing. And then it could also, I think, have a lot to do with, like I said, not necessarily even me in certain instances, although that is a big part of it. I have people in my life who suffer from mental illness, and people, my whole job is providing services for people who deal with different developmental disabilities. So there's a lot there. The idea of someone kind of being tortured by their own mind, at the risk of sounding melodramatic, that's something that I honestly see every time I punch in and go to work. You know what I mean? And people who have dealt with people who have developmental disabilities, many of whom, many people from that population, first of all, require no care and no service, providers like myself. There are many people who live very wonderful, satisfying, independent lives. So I don't want to stereotype people who have developmental disabilities, but I work with people who have a lot of challenges. So maybe that comes out in the lyrics a little bit too. And I think that might explain some of those references,
Interesting. Well, we usually mention this, later in our interviews, and, we are kind of changing tack here a little bit. But given your embrace of somewhat kind of gory or horrific topics, we thought it was interesting that you don't actually swear at all in your lyrics. So across everything you've done for Afterbirth, we only found one curse word. So the line, "Pray you fucking coward," from the newest album. So why do you tend to avoid vulgarity within what would be considered, vulgar topics to some?
There was a great man from New York, Rakim, the microphone fiend. He didn't curse in his lyrics. I love hip hop. I grew up with hip hop. I'm a little bit, I'm 42 now. I'm a little bit in my old school stuff from the 90s and the early 2000s and stuff. And I go back to the 80s with it. But there was a great song with a lot of really great rappers from the early 90s. I think it was called No Cursing or No Swearing. And they all kicked the verse and didn't. So all I'm saying, I used to write a lot of raps. Maybe when I was in my early 20s with a few of my friends, we had it in our heads that we were aspiring rappers. We recorded some songs. I never really went anywhere with it or pursued it as much as I have the death metal. But the idea being in my head that a real lyricist, a real MC doesn't need to curse every other word to get his point across. And I'm not putting anyone down who uses profanity in their lyrics. Again, I'm not here to censor other people, what they do. But me, and for that one line you did mention, you fucking cowards, that's directed at very specific people in my life. So it's like if I do choose to use a curse word in the lyrics, it's there, like I said, it's part of the toolbox. It's there for a reason. And the absence of profanity elsewhere is to make, when I do choose to use it in the lyrics, to have emphasis, right? So yeah, I mean, that's all I can say. It kind of just goes back to me wanting to be what in my head and what I kind of grew to believe was like a real lyricist, a real MC. Even though I'm writing death metal lyrics most of the time, like in my head, there's an element to it of being a rapper, of being an MC, being a front man, you know what I mean? And hip hop and rappers have completely influenced and inspired me over the years in my approach to lyrics. And that's one way, definitely.
Do you swear in your day-to-day life, or is there a...
Well, I do. I swear. I swear I shouldn't swear as much as but I got a nephew, young nephew that I'm very close with. And because of the nature of what I do for a living, I curb myself. I don't just curse like a sailor all day long, but yeah, I mean, you guys hear my accent. I'm from Long Island. My father had a very colorful vocabulary. My mother does too. It's part of the culture. I do try to watch myself. I do try to watch myself, especially in public around people. I've never liked being in crowds of people that would just say whatever came to their mind in front of the general public and families and children and things like that. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm a prude, but I try to watch myself. I definitely have an inclination to curse, though. That's something I do watch,
So there is like a difference between MC, to use your words, you, versus like just day-to-day you in terms of how you approach vulgarity.
Oh yeah. Okay. I mean, it's like when I write lyrics, it's like when you write a speech or a sermon. You know what I mean? It's without getting too deep into it, but it's like, I don't have kids. I don't plan on having kids. What I leave behind with this music is my legacy. You know what I mean? And the lyrics that people read, the music, even nowadays, the videos of live performances and things like this, podcasts and all that sort of thing. This is my legacy. I'm a blue collar artist. You know what I mean? I have my day job. I have family members. I have my little humble life here in Huntington. And what I want to have to show for it at the end of the day is a catalog. I got to a point in my early 30s, without going on too much of a tangent, but like I was like 28 or 29. I had just got out of a long-term relationship. And I was kind of in a space where I was trying to figure some things out. And I wasn't sure where I was at with some of my bands at the time. And I was really inspired by some of those old school Norwegian guys from like Emperor and like if you look at like Mayhem and Emperor and more like the guy Hellhammer, the drummer, there's just these guys who, if you look at their catalog, if you go to Metal Archives or something like that, or Discogs, and you look at what they've been on and what they've recorded and participated in, it's daunting. And some of those guys are in a lot of different projects, a lot of different bands. They have their solo projects. Look at Isan from Emperor, for instance. Those are the people that I look up to and respect. And those are the people that keep a drive in my head to want to be a prolific artist and prolific vocalist and prolific lyricist. This is my legacy. So I'll just leave it there,
Okay. Well, going a bit of a different direction, we want to talk about the way that you frame the stories on your songs. Because back on the Time Traveler's Dilemma, there are 3 songs that talk about a you and 2 talk about an I. And then one talks about something happening in the third person. And there's a total of actually 24 I's and 24 U's, or yours across the album. But they're kind of exclusive. There's only one track where perspective mix with I, you, and he all appearing together. On Four-Dimensional Flesh, it's more open, as there's 3 songs that mention I and you, but 3 only talk about a you, and 1 only talks about an I, leading to 19 I's or me's and 32 U's or yours. Then on the new album, In But Not Of, the first song mentions my nose, they see, and you fucking coward, and the 6th is also mixed with, me and you. But the 2nd is entirely in third person, and the 3rd mostly is, which is one I. And then when you go to the 4th and the 5th and the 7th, it's first person only. But for the last 3 tracks, you switch to being second person only, giving us a total of 17 I's and 18 U's. So this is kind of the setup for a few questions, but the first being, why do you tend to avoid the sort of like, I do something violent to you theming of many metal lyrics, and instead prefer this violent thing happens to me or you, but both of us are probably not in this song approach?
Wow, that's interesting. That's a lot of statistics right there. It's a lot of information.
A little bit of math.
That. No, that's interesting, man. It's interesting. To answer that question, my guess why that occurs more naturally for me is maybe because I don't like the idea of hurting other people in my songs. I don't like that "you fucking coward" line. Yeah, that's somebody very specific that I was sending a message to, but I don't fantasize about just killing random people. I don't fantasize about hurting women. I don't fantasize about hurting animals. But there is maybe that vibe, and maybe that part of me that is, not everyone, but a lot of us have a little self-loathing. A lot of us, at times when we do a little self-reflection, we find reasons to be angry at ourselves. Maybe that's part of it. You know what I mean? I don't know, because that's kind of like a deep philosophical question. Why do I attack myself more than other people in the lyrics? I mean, maybe it also has something to do with preferring that perspective for the lyrics. Maybe I feel like that is somehow more horrific if you're reading them from the perspective of someone who's experiencing these things rather than just describing them. I guess that would be my best answer I could give you at the moment. That's something to think of. That's food for thought.
And on these songs where you do describe like an I perspective, does that always represent you? Like, so you mentioned earlier that like, the frog lyrics that we talked about, like croaking from my cheeks, I don't speak, or if people only knew the frog that's in my throat was all a dream within my brain, is representative of you. But is that the case in your other songs? Like whenever you're talking from that I perspective, does it always represent like an aspect of you, or is it, a character that you're embodying?
That's interesting, because it's probably a little bit confusing, because like, for those lines, it's obviously, kind of breaking fourth wall, and it's me. But then, as I said, that song, autoerotic asphyxiation, there is a narrative that's from the perspective of a serial killer stalking his running through the tall grass. I see them as objects. And that is supposed to be more the like a cinematic narrative of or like a fictional narrative of a character. In this book, I wouldn't say that that's as much me like expressing some personal thing inside of me as me trying to tell a story. The same way a fiction writer would. So I guess it kind of shifts here and there. Some songs are meant to be, just a fictional narrative the way a storyteller would. And occasionally that storyteller is going to inject things that they know about from their life. And then occasionally, yes, there are lines that I kind of just have to get out from my own perspective. It's a bit of a mix.
So, like, given the horrific subject matter in a lot of your lyrics, is distinguishing your own personal identity from that character in certain songs like a concern for you, or do you kind of just embrace this this ambiguity of where you end and the character begins?
I think that I was just thinking about, as you were asking that question, it occurred to me, maybe that has something to do with this hip hop rapper influence, because when you write, there's all different. There's a million different rappers, especially nowadays. There's any style of writing and rap, there's all different rappers now, but the kind of rap I grew up with and listened to, it's more of that just, I grew up with a lot of, old school New York East Coast rappers where it was just about having a tight 16 bars, having a tight flow, And you could say it doesn't matter what you say in that 16 bars, whether it's from a first person narrative or from someone else, or you're telling a story. It just has to be tight and sound good. So it's like maybe that is kind of where I think that has maybe influenced my own writing style to the point where it's kind of like I am, like a lot of rappers, they might be telling you a story, but they'll come back, every couple of lines. Yeah, it's me, I don't know. I think that's where that mix comes from of you're telling a story. You're like a lot of rappers, they're blurring the lines between reality and the mythology because they're telling stories from their perspective, but it's something that they know happened to someone else. They're telling stories that did happen to them, but they're exaggerating them. They're telling completely made up fictional stories, and they're doing this all within one song. You know what I mean? So I think that's where the liberty to kind of just bend narrative and perspective kind of maybe comes from for me, or maybe why I don't worry about it.
Makes sense, yeah. But what about the you in lines like, for instance, like to see the truth in your mind, they destroyed my life, or ravenous downturned faces who you meet at your demise, they watched you the moment you were born from the sky, that's why they can't look you in the eyes. Like, is this a specific person that you're imagining when you write lyrics like this, or is it a more kind of generic you?
You mentioned you fucking coward was specific.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you keep bringing that up, I might have to name the person. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, well, like that one was specific. The inside your mind, that was maybe more of a general, because the perspective from that line, like look inside your mind or whatever, that's maybe more of kind of like a written as like an instruction manual for the listener type of thing, look inside your mind. But all the other references you just mentioned were really, if I'm going to be honest, about some sort of interdimensional or demonic parasite creature. So, some unseen entity, really. I mean, all those references you mentioned were kind of referencing something along those lines.
Is this the same for like the use of they or the actor in a lot of your songs? Like, as we mentioned, both you and I in your lyrics is often subjected to some kind of punishment by malignant force. Like in Rooms to Nowhere, you're locked in a kind of gas-filled rooms, and everything in its path. A you is ground up into mush. In Vomit on Humanity, you have words carved rigid into your scars and end up in the song with your a vomit going up to your eyeballs. And on Angels Feast on Flies, ravenous downturned faces come to meet you at your demise. On each of these tracks, like, are you imagining a distinct malignant entity or some kind of thing, or is it just sort of a broad, vague, horrific something?
I think each instance might be something a little different, might be referencing something different. And I don't necessarily, like, what I'm expressing in those lyrics may not actually be a 100% representation of my own spiritual beliefs or my own philosophies. Like I said, a lot of this could be influenced by horror movies and fictional narratives I've read, but I guess I would just say maybe it's written in kind of a warning way, an ominous. It's supposed to strike an ominous tone, right? A kind of a forewarning tone, which might come from being raised in a Catholic environment, being raised in a strict Catholic school type of environment, or it might even have to do more with that kind of. I don't know, man. That's a tough question. That's a tough one to place. But I can tell you that in general, when I use that word "you," it's more for like the listener, you, whoever you are reading this, you. There's not often a specific you. You know what I mean? Like you cowards. There's that one. There might be a few other instances, but a lot of the time, I know when I use that, it's more just kind of like a device. You know what I mean? It's like to speak to the observer.
Well, throughout your catalogue, you've maintained a pretty strong balance of I and you references. But as mentioned, In But Not Of switches perspective after its title track, going entirely into discussions of you and then abandoning the I-me perspective. So was this intentional? And, if not, like, why do you reckon it occurred?
Well, I can say definitely with that album, and very often the song or the order of the songs as they play on the album doesn't necessarily reflect how I've arranged them lyrically.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I have yet with any of my bands, I believe, to do that kind of like Operation Mindcrime thing where the lyrics all form like a consistent story. And I wanted to at times, and it just never worked out. Everyone has a lot of ideas about the order of the songs, which should be how they should go, and it never really worked out to that, and maybe that was, there's better ways to lay it out from the beginning of the writing process. I don't want to lay blame on anyone for that. But like within but not of, definitely we went through a few different lists of track orders for that. So it wasn't intentional. And all I can think of is maybe the reason why there's a little bit less of that on In But Not Of is because there's tons of that on the latest Reeking Aura album, which is pretty much all from the narrator's perspective.
Okay, interesting. So we're going to change topics here to a rather weird question. But are you aware that you've never written a song for Afterbirth with a single word title? Instead, you have 6 2-word titles, 17 3-word titles, and 11 4+ word titles. Do you know why you prefer 3+ words for song titles?
Because there's less of a chance of another band having the same song title.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's
very
incredibly pragmatic. Yeah. All right.
With Afterbirth, they came up with the band in 1993. And a one-word album, a one-word band name back then was back then there was not as many death metal bands. You could be Death, you could be Grave, you could be Obituary. Nowadays there's like, when we named Reeking Aura, we had a list of 20 names and we Googled every name because we don't want to, you don't want to be in a band and recorded an EP and make shirts and then you find out there's another band in Ohio with the same name. Sure. That happens constantly. So same thing, I guess, is my thinking with song titles. Now, with Afterbirth, like I said, probably 80 to 90% of the song titles over the years have been contributed by Cody. So that's more his thing. But I think it's more about being original and not having the same thing as anyone else. That's kind of where it goes.
Okay.
Why that might be.
Well, moving to talk about Artificial Brain a bit. For 19 of the 30 songs you've written for Artificial Brain, they're actually 2 words long, which matches the 2 words band name in contrast to Afterbirth never having a single word song. Is this just by chance, or like, did you intentionally try to have a lot of like 2 word matches?
Well, I think that's just my style naturally. And there were times where I became conscious of that and attempted to have like 3-word or 4-word titles because I realized it was a thing in Artificial Brain. It wasn't intentional. It was more just that's because like I said, Afterbirth, Cody comes up with the majority of the song titles. So that way, when you look at the backs of the CDs and read the song titles, it doesn't seem like the same exact, guy writing them. Artificial Brain, I wrote the vast majority of the song titles. Maybe 1 or 2 here or there. The other guys would contribute ideas, but I came up with, lyrically, that was like my baby. And it just turned out that kind of writing these 2-word song titles that have a little bit of a alliteration to them, so they flow, just was like my go-to natural instinct. And over time, I literally would try to come up with song titles that were 3 words or that, just to be a little different from what we had been doing. So that if anything, it's funny that you caught on to that because it's like that was something I was actively trying to change, on the last album I did with the band because I was aware that that's something I kind of went to a lot.
Actually, I'm going to jump ahead to one of our questions in advance because you mentioned alliteration. And we did notice that Artificial Brain has a lot of that. But we didn't see it very much with Afterbirth. So I'm not saying there's none, but it's very blatant in your Artificial Brain lyrics. Like just off the 2022 release, we have map making, mainframe, inhibitive instructions, skin we stretch, rusted robotic arms, captured catastrophe, mixed by its molecules, song titles like Celestial Cyst, and the thoughts that torture me I keep within, the truth I tortured them just on a whim. Why do you gravitate towards alliteration, and why is it kind of specifically for the Artificial Brain project, whereas we don't see it as much on your others?
Well, first of all, Celestial Cyst is one song title that another member of that band came up with, to give credit where credit's due. But that's a good question. I might have something to do with wanting to differentiate the styles of the bands, and with the alliteration itself goes back to hip hop. Goes straight back to rapping and hip hop and maybe injecting a little bit of humor into the flow sometimes. Because when you have it's like that Dr. Seussian type of thing. Even if I'm describing something grotesque or some outer space zombie, if you have that alliteration in there, there's just kind of something a little pompous about it that could be funny, I guess. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know, like I'm making myself a little pompous as the lyricist by adding that alliteration in there. And then some of it also is to kind of, I try to write things where like very niche listeners of my band will get, like somebody who first they have to read the lyrics of the bands, which some people don't. Second, they have to like be familiar with hip hop and know how like, how a rap flow kind of sounds. And then they might get certain things in my lyrics, like, oh, he wrote that as like a, kind of like as if it was almost like a rap line, So I guess that's it, man. There's a big hip hop influence there. And with Artificial Brain, I guess I felt a lot more creative license with the lyrics. I was the prime lyricist. I came up with the concepts. Those guys every once in a while would pitch me a concept, but it was a little bit more my ballpark. Whereas Afterbirth, not to say I don't have freedom to write, but it's more collaborative. Mm-hmm. Cody, from when I joined the band, Cody has been involved in the writing process, and I don't question that. I wouldn't seek to change that. I enjoy it. It makes it different, and maybe that's also why I approach the songs a little different. The other thing is with Afterbirth, maybe I think the nature of the music made, with Artificial Brain, there were maybe more parts that lent themselves to those kind of flows, whereas Afterbirth, it's a little bit more choppy and breaking it up, and the timing is a little different. So I don't know, man. There's a few differences there, but that's the best I could do with that.
Well, speaking of other differences that we saw, in that last Artificial Brain album that you did in 2022, self-titled, we did see that as opposed to your work with Afterbirth, there's no song in the second person on that Artificial Brain album. So there are 4 yous, but none actually refer to somebody else. So 3 are on Parasite Signal, where the first person narrator pauses to describe how a scanning panel hovers at your hand, and to your feet it falls. It's blinking red, and to your horror. But the song is framed still around that I perspective, telling about what happens in like a hypothetical. Before then returning, my screams turn to gurgles as I fade in and out of this life. I failed to warn the others. And that 4th you on the final track is someone speaking to the I in the song. So again, it's still kind of centered around the I. So do you know why you adopted a kind of solely first person approach for this record?
I do. It's interesting to hear that analysis of it. Okay, so first of all, Parasite Signal is one song that it's supposed to be, if people are familiar with that band and with the lyrics, there's a song called Worm Harvester, which I think was on the first album. Parasite Signal is basically a direct sequel to Worm Harvester. It takes place in the same setting. When someone's being overcome by this kind of parasitic alien on a spaceship. That's a little bit more straight up just influenced by aliens and sci-fi and trying to be a short story type of song. Whereas a lot of the other stuff on that last Artificial Brain album that I was on was written from the first person. It reflected, I was kicked out of that band. We had a lot of personal differences and didn't get along. And a lot of the lyrics on that self-titled Artificial Brain album really were me processing getting kicked out of the band. I recorded the vocals, might have been almost a year, 9 months after getting kicked out of the band, because that was during the pandemic when nothing was going on. They said, we had some of the songs written, and they agreed that I would do the vocals on the album, and I agreed too, because I had written a lot of that stuff, and in the end, a lot of those lyrics became my message to the Artificial Brain supporters and fans, and maybe reflected some of the turmoil in the band, within that science fiction setting. There was also a big thing with that album where, like I said, I had wanted to do a concept album. Artificial Brain has a lot of overlapping concepts and stories within the lyrics, and I had wanted that album to kind of bring them all together in a way. I still have like 25 pages in my notebook of notes and notes from other lyrics and trying to bring everything together. That's why I was conscious of doing Parasite Signal as a sequel to the song Worm Harvester from the other album. There's a lot of lyrics on the third album that are kind of quoted or maybe taken and changed around, or that reference other lyrics from prior Artificial Brain albums a lot. So people who really read the lyrics and who read the lyrics on the first 2 Artificial Brain albums can get something out of the lyrics on that self-titled album, that final one that I was on. There's Easter eggs in the lyrics for people that pay attention to my lyrics. I really put my heart and soul into that lyrically. There's a lot here. And that's probably explained. I think that probably answers your question.
So the I on that album then is more often you than on, say, the Afterbirth tracks.
Well, yes, absolutely. The I on you could say that. I guess I made myself a character in a science fiction story that was being told through the lyrics, and there was some, I maybe more so than usual. I made some of the themes and ideas parallel what I really was feeling.
Well, speaking of that kind of sci-fi subject matter, like broadly speaking, while Artificial Brain does touch on horror, as in lines like insects nesting in its eyes feeding off the mound, we do see, a lot more of that kind of sci-fi theme in Artificial Brain. So lines like rewiring self-destruct protocols to terminate, vicarious visions blinking every night into a cryogenic dream world of my design, or disposing of the body's incineration projected through the atmosphere. Obviously don't fit with what we see in Afterbirth. So did this sci-fi approach allow you to explore ideas that you can't typically explore with Afterbirth, or, conversely, did it prevent you from exploring certain concepts?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think the only reason I didn't explore as much sci-fi with Afterbirth was because I was consciously trying to keep the 2 bands separate when I was in both bands for a few years there at the same time. So there was a conscious effort to keep both bands a little bit separate thematically and aesthetically. But also with Artificial Brain, I joined that band very early on when they only had a few songs written, and the concept from the go was sci-fi death metal, space death metal influenced by science fiction movies and science fiction media. And I was, I say no more. I'm with it. I love a lot of that stuff. So that's for that. Whereas Afterbirth, when I first joined with Time Traveler's Dilemma, it was a little more sci-fi. There was some sci-fi has always crept in there. But there, like I said, Cody comes up with a lot of the concepts for Afterbirth, always has. And Cody's a very deep thinker, very spiritual person. And I think that's maybe why Afterbirth is more of that. So it's like a little bit of Cody's penchant for philosophical and spiritual themes, but also trying to keep Afterbirth rooted in where it comes from, which is that gory 90s brutal death metal. That's like a big balance with Afterbirth is, we love Cynic and Atheists and Defeated Sanity and all these kind of forward-thinking bands, but we never want to be that band where they say, oh, they forgot about their demo. They forgot, where they come from. They forgot why people loved them in the first place, especially for me, because I wasn't in the band on that classic demo. I grew up listening to that classic demo. So I even sometimes see, like on the last album, I saw it maybe as a little bit my responsibility to keep it brutal and to keep it guttural because the other guys were doing such expansive musical ideas. You know what I mean? So it's like with Artificial Brain, to answer your question, with Artificial Brain, it was sci-fi from the go. That was the whole idea. And we weren't really trying to have any lyrics that weren't sci-fi. Right. And that's where I learned to kind of just anything I wanted to express, I just put it in sci-fi terms, It it's like there's a meme so it happened on a spaceship, so it's sci-fi. You know what I mean? Or whatever. It's like that type of thing. You know what I mean? I kind of got into that area. Like I just told you, I expressed a lot of real personal stuff on that last Artificial Brain album, but it was through this other character. You know what I mean? On a spaceship somewhere or something. Whereas Afterbirth is a lot more introspective and deep, quote unquote, whatever you want to say.
Well, one of the commonalities we did see across Afterbirth and Artificial Brain is that both projects do involve a kind of substantial amount of rhyme. As in, for example, some come from the sea, some live in the trees, some smell the blood by the break of the breeze, off the newest Afterbirth, and rusted robotic arms flailing wild, unknowing in a way unlike a child, exploring aimlessly the vast terrain, haphazard, haywired, Artificial Brain. So what draws you to this use of rhyme across the 2 projects?
Hip hop again. I mean, my favorite rappers are the rappers that are real wordsmiths. If I don't know if you listen to a lot of hip hop or if you're familiar with the guys I'm about to bring up, but if you want to listen to like amazing, regardless of if you like hip hop, regardless of if you like rap and urban culture, if you want to hear amazing lyricism, Big Punisher, rapper from the 90s. He had a lot of hits. That man, a supernatural talent, amazing talent to write and perform these rhymes, the most complex rhyme schemes. A lot of his style comes from Cool G Rap. Cool G Rap innovated that multi-syllabic fast rhyme style like Eminem is very well known for. I respect Eminem, but I'm very New York with what I listen to. I like Eminem too, but AZ, there's a rapper just like the letters AZ from Brooklyn, prolific rapper who's kind of always been putting out material regardless of whether he's in the limelight or not ever since the 90s. Amazing wordplay, amazing lyricism. That's what I listen to. That's what I love hip hop for, is the wordplay, the lyricism, the writing. And I try to express a lot of that in my lyrics. That's the best answer I could give you for that. A lot of it comes from hip hop. So,
well, the last project we want to talk about very briefly is the one that we have lyrics for, is Reeking Aura, which seems to kind of take the gore that's present in Afterbirth and a little bit in Artificial Brain up to a higher level. For instance, the limbs you'll have to lose so I can eat within my budget, disassembly, delicacy, the smell of meat, pickle the feet, reference cannibalism in a pretty straightforward terms that we didn't really see on any of the other projects. If you agree with this assessment, what does exploring decay, murder, etc., to this extent afford you creatively that you aren't allowed to do or don't feel you're allowed to do in your other projects? And we don't mean this as like a value judgment, but just personally, what does this project and this style of lyric writing afford you that you don't find with your other work?
It's more death metal. Well, first of all, those lines that you referenced just now, pickle the feet and all that, that is a direct homage. Again, I'm trying to put Easter eggs in the lyrics for people who read the lyrics and who know a lot of death metal. It's a direct homage to a old school New Jersey death metal band, Torture Crypt, who had a song called Disassembly about the same type of subject matter. And the way I wrote those lyrics is kind of a homage to parts in that song. But maybe that's that right there. It's out of a love for the culture of death metal. And it's also embracing the gore part of death metal a little bit. Reeking Aura is, like I said, there's a lot of agriculture. There's a lot of wildlife. There's a lot of, maybe exaggerated parts of my youth growing up on Long Island and with my father, who was kind of a rough blue collar, outdoorsy guy. There's a lot of that in there. Something I've neglected to mention in this interview, my uncle, not a blood relative, but a lifelong friend of the family, as were his parents to my grandparents. And, they all know each other, his brothers and my aunt and the director, Frank Henenlotter, who's known for, he's a horror movie director out of New York City who has a cult following. And he's known for the movies Basket Case, Brain Damage, Frankenhooker. Yeah, he's I call him Uncle Frank, and I mainly see him at weddings and funerals for the most part because he lives in New York City. But from a very young age, he was the one that got me into horror movies. And if you've ever seen the movie Basket Case, there's a scene with two twin nurses. That's my mother and my aunt. And because of that, yes,
that's amazing.
So you're familiar with the movie?
Yeah.
Doctor, I have I have a picture on my wall, but that's my mother and my aunt passed away 2 years ago. Rest in peace. But yeah, it's my mother and my aunt. They're twin sisters. They were in the movie. So because of that, I think allowed to be exposed to that sort of thing at a young age. Mm-hmm. This is what Uncle Frank does. It's all fake. Mama was in it, and da-da-da. And I had a curiosity for it at, 12, 13. So gore has always been there, but I was also taught from a young age that that's your funny Uncle Frank who you can trust. He just makes horror movies. You know what I mean? So it wasn't, there was always that kind of wall there. I didn't have an uncle who tortured cats. I had an uncle who made horror movies. You know what I mean? That so different vibes. So I am embracing gore a little bit there. And like I said, I love gore movies. A lot of, I have a whole closet full of CDs and records of death metal. Obviously, there's some gore in there. Obviously, there's some stuff there that maybe is a little too far for what I would do in my bands. It's part of it. It's just not necessarily a part of it I've always wanted to express. And there's plenty of death metal out there if people don't realize that has nothing to do with gore. There's, nowadays the field's wide open. I guess that's my answer there is Reeking Aura is a little bit more gory because it's kind of me trying to get in touch with that because I don't do it in other projects as much,
That's super cool. That's amazing. Like that little link to the history of horror movies is not, someone didn't expect.
I forget to bring that up sometimes. And there was a long time where I purposely would not bring that up because I never wanted to seem like I was trying to, ride his coattails or, Frank Henenlotter's nephew, the death metal singer, that type of thing. I never wanted to be that person that's always bragging about that, like it's some sort of connection, but it is there, and he is a very important part of my life.
That's super cool. Well, our final question about Reeking Aura is just that the album for Reeking Aura also has the second swear word that we found in your discography, which is I wrote this in shit on the walls to explain what people find. Given that this album is also clean, despite uncleanliness being a major subject of the album, why did shit get a place there and nowhere else? Why is it's the only shit you've ever written as far as we can see?
Well,
your 14-year-old album that we don't have access to. Obviously,
I'm pretty sure you're right. Well, the narrative on that album is supposed to be from the perspective of someone who's definitely suffering from mental illness, to put it lightly, and having, quite a breakdown. And your question before about why is there filth in the lyrics? Why is there dirtiness? If I'm going to be really honest with you, I worked with people who have multiple developmental disabilities and lots of challenges beyond what an average person with autism or Down syndrome might deal with. Where I work at specifically is a setting for people who have a lot of different challenges. I work with people who have fecal alcohol syndrome, people who have, more than just maybe what people kind of think autism is on TikTok or something, so to speak. Right. And because of that, I've had to deal with and be witness to a lot of sensitive situations. Somebody smearing shit on a wall. Somebody, it's nothing new to me. And it's nothing new to corrections officers. It's nothing new to nurses. It's nothing new to people who work in psych wards. It's nothing new to people who have members of their family who unfortunately have who have a challenge similar to that. You know what I mean? And again, I'm not trying to stereotype or say this is a generalization of people with developmental disabilities. It's just the exact population that requires services where I work. So I've been able to process that. I've been able to thrive at my job. I enjoy my job, and it's not the everyday of the job all day long, 8 hours a day, where you're dealing with very difficult situations, but it is something I have had to be exposed to and witness over 17 years, and I've been aggressed on, I've been bitten by people, I've had to separate people who were fighting each other, and yes, I have had to deal with situations where people were smearing blood, smearing fecal matter, masturbating, you name it. I interviewed Jordan Mamaluk from the singer of Immortal Suffering from here in New York, and he works in a psychiatric hospital, and we kind of commiserated on some of these things. So I'm not trying to bring the conversation down or anything, but if I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, that's what comes to mind, and that's maybe where some of those things come from, and that's why I have to vent them out in my lyrics. And maybe there is a part of me when I'm writing the lyrics in my head, like I said before, it's like, you don't know what's on my mind. You don't know what I've seen. You know what I mean? Yes, I am this kind of big, big friendly death metal singer. I shake hands at the shows. I try to be as nice and considerate to people as I can in the scene and all that sort of thing. But there is a dark side, and we're trying to express that through metal. I think that's pretty consistent with a lot of artists.
Well, this leads in really nicely to our final question, which is, broadly speaking, what would you say is the role of lyrics in Afterbirth's music and in your other projects?
Proving to people that there are lyrics, and I'm not just making it up, like some people insinuate. No, it's interesting because it's like, what are that's almost, there's almost a broader question there. What's the purpose of lyrics in death metal?
That was our next question.
We're going to ask, yeah.
Okay. I'll slow down. Well, the purpose of the lyrics in Afterbirth and my other bands, it's in a very selfish way. It's for my own self-expression, for my own ego. Because, like I said, you point out, I don't curse. I take a lot of meticulous care in my lyrics. I quote and reference other lyrics I've written in the past and include them in there for anyone who might be paying attention. Yes, it does feed my ego. Let's be real. It's some of it is me trying to show off. Some of it is me expressing myself. It's like creative writing. You know what I mean? And it's very indulgent for me, but at the same time, if I can come up with lyrics that my bandmates enjoy and my bandmates are happy to include, and they think the lyrics add depth to what they've created, then everyone's happy. And lyrics are not important for every death metal listener. I go into this knowing that there are people who buy Afterbirth shirts and CDs and come to the shows and do not know one word of the lyrics because they couldn't be bothered to read it. It's a big death metal scene. Some people are just into it because they like my drummer. Some people are just into it because they like my guitarist. They could care less what I'm doing. Some people listen to the band in spite of me because they don't like what I'm doing, but they like what the guitarist is doing. There's a million different ways to do this. So I do the lyrics for myself. That's why I take so much pride in them and take so much meticulous care in them. Because, like I said before, it's my legacy as an artist. That's what I want to leave. That's what I want to contribute. And when people read them, if they know me personally, I want them to go, wow, I didn't know that was going on in Will's head. And if they don't know me, I want them to go, wow, there's something going on behind these vocals. There's something deeper than just grrr, all that stuff. So that's my answer.
Well, then to shock you with this unsurprising, this next question that you did not know was coming, what do you think is the role of lyrics in extreme metal more broadly then?
Well, it's, you have to have an aesthetic. You have to have a theme. And I guess, sometimes, even if you didn't have lyrics, that would stop at the song titles and the album title. You have to have something. You know what I mean? Like, even if, all right, so with my vocal style where you just the guttural vocals, or like if Devourment, Disgorge, Defeated Sanity, these bands that have the vocals that no one can understand, Wormed, right? If those bands put out an album with no actual lyrics and the guy was just improvising, there are some bands that do that. At the end of the day, they would have to make song titles, right? I mean, they might maybe just put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's a concept in itself, but you know what I mean? There has to be some substance there. What are you trying to say? Even like look at classical music or instrumental music, jazz, where there's no lyric. The song title speaks sometimes to a theme, to something that happened in the artist's life, to some concept. You know what I mean? Why is Richard Wagner so controversial? You know what I mean, man? It's just guys playing violins and harps, right? No, there's depth, there's lore, there's concepts to music, whether it's any type of music you can imagine. I mean, maybe the lyrics in death metal are not as crucial, or maybe I should say not as upfront and not as big a part as in rap, where like lyrics are everything, or at one point they were. But the lyrics, or at least the song titles, the album titles, what are you going to have the cover artist portray and paint or draw if you don't have lyrics, if you don't have song titles? You know what I mean? That's the whole, every CD behind, there might be one or two where it's like, just there's no real cover, it's just text or something, but they did that as a decision, but they're doing that to be different because every other band in the world has something going on. That's why you have controversial National Socialist black metal. Without the National Socialist part, it would just be black metal. You know what I mean? That's why you have vegan bands. Look at a band like Earth Crisis. They started a whole movement because their lyrics were about veganism and social activism. You know what I mean? Without that, it would just be distorted guitars and guys yelling. So it's like, or then look at Slayer. Slayer in the 80s, their lyrics were obviously the extremity of the music. I'm not going to discount Slayer's music. I'm a Slayer fan, but their lyrics were so controversial. People thought that there were, teenagers were killing other teenagers because of Slayer, which in some cases, that's debatable, drugs, environment, and all that sort of, that's a whole other concept. The satanic panic's a big thing for me, but I think I've kind of made my point. You see where I'm going,
Yeah. Interesting. Well, thank you. This has been really, really fascinating. Thank you for being so open and talking to us about all this. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, really fascinating interview.
I really appreciate you guys inviting me on. This has been amazing. I really feel like you've kind of turned me inwards to examine my own. Like, you pointed out themes and kind of like running themes and concepts in my lyrics I wasn't aware of. So I appreciate it. This is going to be on my mind when I'm writing for the new album.
Awesome. We'd love to hear that.
But it started like I started worrying about that. Like, I feel like as a scientist or whatever, as a researcher, I'm
we're impacting our subjects.
We're impacting by observing, we're accidentally impacting the data, and now it's not.
That's how it is. Observer's paradox,
Yeah.
unavoidable. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you could also do the next project could be like what after you explain these statistics and facts to a lyricist, what do they do with it?
What have we done?
Well, that's something we've been thinking about is should we revisit some of these artists and see if they have actually been impacted by these conversations, if it's ended up influencing their thoughts even in a really minor way, when they go to write their next album or whatever.
I wouldn't worry about it ethically or anything like that. I mean, you guys are a little bit more data driven, but every person eventually has to read reviews and have their music dissected in one way or another, and it is what it is. None of us really live in a bubble. It's fun.
Yeah,
it is what it is. And there might be people. A lot of us death metal vocalists are probably so pigheaded. We're not going to let you influence us one way or another.
That's always good to hear.
Exactly.
That's lovely. Well, so if people want to check out more of what you're doing, obviously, you just had the new Afterbirth album, so I imagine there's not one coming down in the next few months or anything like that. But where can people keep up with your work with all these projects? Do you have any tours coming out, anything like that?
Yes, Afterbirth is headlining the Connecticut Death Fest.
Sick.
Day 2. We're very excited. March 9th, I believe that is. You can look up Connecticut Death Fest. We're headlining day 2 of that. The first weekend in March. We are, by the time this comes out, we probably will have already played with Tomb Mold at St. Vitus. We're looking forward to that. No other plans with Afterbirth yet. We're kind of taking it as it comes, but I can tell you, writing is already going on for a future album. That's but it's a lengthy process, obviously. But after you can just check us, like anyone else, check us out on social media. Afterbirth's always keeping busy and working on stuff. Same with Reeking Aura. We're going into the studio. After I get back from that Connecticut Death Fest, Reeking Aura is going into the studio to record our second album with Colin Marston. That's going to be on Profound Lore Records. Exsanguinated. Most of the guys in Exsanguinated are in the band Stabbed, who are doing a lot of stuff and are really busy right now. And I'm happy for them because they're my friends. So Exsanguinated's on a little bit of a hold now, maybe until a few months from now in the end. But people could check for Exsanguinated. We got a 2-song demo out. We played some shows. And Heavy Hole Podcast is my podcast. We've been going for since 2019. I've done hundreds of interviews with not just death metal artists, people who own labels, record store owners, random metal fans. We had a whole episode on Christian metal. I had a whole episode with a father-son death metal head, a team that comes to shows locally. I try to give people a little bit of insight into the history and culture of this thing. So Heavy Hole Podcast is my other baby. We're on, all the usual social medias and streaming platforms and Patreon. And I think that's about it for now.
Cool. Well,
awesome.
Thank you very much.
We'll link all of those in the episode description.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. It was great meeting you guys. I really appreciate this. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much.
Love to hear that. Yeah. And I guess we'll I suppose ending things we always do by encouraging you to tour Australia sometime. That'd be pretty sick.
Yeah, please do.
I would love it. I would absolutely love it. That's why I'm in 3 bands, because somebody's got to hit somewhere. You know what I mean?
Yeah, one of them's got to come to Australia eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a numbers game nowadays. You just got to be spread out in a few different bands, and something will happen, man. But
cool.
we could set this up for the future when you guys have time. But I would love to have you on my podcast and kind of reverse roles and ask you guys about all this research you do and the nature of what you're doing too. That would be great.
Yeah, man, absolutely.
Yeah, we'd love that.
Yeah, sounds great.
All right,
you got our email. Let's organize it.
Hit us up. Yeah.
You haven't lost me yet. When you put out the episode, we'll be in touch and all that. So we'll talk it over.
Sounds cool.
Sweet.
All right, guys.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. Cool.
All right. Take care, man. Have a good one.
Have a great night, guys. Take
Thanks
care.
a lot.
Peace.
Thank you for listening to Lingua Italica. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stay tuned for our next episode. Before we leave, we just wanted to acknowledge that this podcast is recorded on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay respects to their elders, past and present.